Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. From this government's first day in office, we have been focused on the various drivers that will grow the economy, to create good, solid jobs and genuine opportunity for the middle class and all those who are working so hard just to get there. That's why we cut middle class taxes and bolstered family incomes with the new Canada Child Benefit. That's why we increased federal support for students, skills and learning. And that's why we're investing in innovation and infrastructure. And that's also why we're seizing meaningful opportunities to expand international trade through new and improved trade agreements, through trade missions and marketing, and through initiatives that help move both people and goods across international boundaries in faster, easier, and more efficient ways, all while maintaining our safety and security and respecting our rights. Bill C-23, an act respecting the preclearance of persons and goods in Canada and the United States, is very much aimed in this latter direction. This legislation will allow more Canadians and more Canadian businesses to enjoy the convenience and the economic benefits of clearing American customs and immigration procedures in Canada before entering the U.S. Expanded preclearance will strengthen Canada's economic competitiveness by accelerating the flow of legitimate trade and travel while enhancing the security of our border. Moreover, it will allow more Canadian travellers to complete U.S. border procedures while under the protective umbrella of Canadian law and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canada and the United States are each other's top trading partners, and the cross-border economy is essential to our shared prosperity. Nearly $2.5 billion in goods and services cross the Canada-U.S. border every day. In fact, some $1.5 million worth of goods and services have crossed that border since I began speaking about 2 minutes ago. Our exports to the United States constitute more than 20% of Canada's GDP, and 2.5 million jobs rely on those exports to our southern neighbour. And there's more, Madam Speaker. In 2015, over 600,000 Canadian jobs were directly attributable to tourism, and Americans represented over 2/3 of the nearly 18 million overnight visitors Canada received in that year. In all, more than 400,000 people cross our land border every single day. Border benefits flow both ways. Some 9 million U.S. jobs depend directly on trade with Canada, and Canada is the primary export destination for 35 American states. Clearly, the movement of people and goods across the border is vital to the dynamism of the North American economy and a powerful engine for growth and job creation in both countries. However, border delays and concerns about potential delays can be a very significant impediment to economic growth. Our government is committed to addressing that. A central element of our campaign platform was a commitment to build a solid foundation for greater trade, stronger growth, and more job creation by working to reduce the barriers that limit trade and by promoting a steadier flow and goods. Some years ago, Canada and the United States began working on a new legal framework for the preclearance system between our two countries. But it was not implemented, and it didn't include a definite business plan for the expansion of preclearance. Through this past year, we tackled those deficiencies, building on more than 6 decades of successful preclearance experience between Canada and the United States. Our expansion plans will begin with new preclearance services for air passengers at Billy Bishop Island Airport in Toronto and Jean-Lesage Airport in Quebec City, and for rail passengers heading into the United States from Montreal Central Station and on the Rocky Mountaineer Railway in British Columbia. We have also agreed to regularize preclearance operations at certain rail and marine sites in BC that currently offer a partial service, and this improvement, Madam Speaker, will be especially significant for the West Coast cruise ship business. One of the steps on the path to all of this expansion is the adoption of new legislation in both countries. The requisite American legislation was signed into law last December after being adopted by Congress with unusually unanimous support in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the related Canadian legislation is what we are examining today. Before I get into some of the details of Bill C-23, let me take a moment to discuss what exactly preclearance is and what benefits Canadians can expect from its expansion. Preclearance simply means that rather than customs and immigration procedures happening just after you cross the physical border or after landing at a U.S. airport, they happen in advance. Canadians who have flown to the U.S. from one of the 8 airports in this country where preclearance is currently conducted, that's Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Pearson, Ottawa, Montreal, and Halifax. People flying out of those airports to the U.S. are very familiar with how preclearance works and what the advantages are. Travelers are cleared for entry into the United States by U.S. border officials before they board the plane, which means they avoid lineups and delays after they land. They can also fly directly to any U.S. airport, including airports like LaGuardia in New York City or Reagan Airport in Washington, D.C., which do not have full customs facilities and ordinarily receive only domestic U.S. flights. Pearson Airport in Toronto, for example, presently offers direct flights to 50 American destinations. Without preclearance, that number would drop to 27. Preclearance makes it easier not only for Canadians to travel to the United States, but for Canadian businesses to attract American tourists and business travelers to Canada, which is obviously a major benefit for local economies. That's why there has been so much support for the planned expansion that we announced last spring that will be enabled by the bill that is before us now. Suite à l'annonce au printemps.
Following the announcement last spring, the president of the Quebec City Chamber of Commerce and Industry declared that we have reached a historic milestone with regard to the accessibility of the region. According to the mayor, Régis Lebaume, the arrival of preclearance at Jean-Lesage Airport is a great victory for his city. And, in the words of the president of the Quebec City Airport Authority, this grand project will forever change the face of the airport by considerably reducing travel times to the United States and by enhancing the client experience of our passengers.
The president of the BC Chamber of Commerce has said that the agreement to expand preclearance will help businesses grow and avoid spending time in border lineups. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has welcomed the expansion because preclearance operations, which have existed in one form or another for over 60 years, have been, in the words of the Chamber, a massive success that greatly reduces congestion at the border and allows for streamlined processing of trusted trade and travel. In short, Madam Speaker, Bill C-23 will be good for business all over the country, good for tourism, and good as well for ordinary Canadian travellers. The first part of Bill C-23 sets out the Canadian legislative framework that will govern American officers conducting preclearance in Canada of people and goods that are bound for the United States. In general, travelers already familiar with the way preclearance works won't notice any difference. As is already the case, American preclearance officers will be authorized to collect the same information from travelers that is collected by U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers at regular U.S. points of entry. And in many other respects, including search authorities, detention authorities, and penalties for lying to an officer, Bill C-23 is generally similar to the law governing preclearance that is currently in effect and has been so since at least 1999. I know there are always concerns about the authorities that U.S. officers would have in Canada, just as there are always concerns across the border about the authorities Canadian officers would have in the U.S. I can assure the House that our government takes very seriously the need to protect the rights of travelers and to ensure that they're treated fairly and in accordance with the rule of law. And I will therefore take just a few moments to address some of the concerns that have been mentioned in public. First, with respect to searches, the current law allows a U.S. preclearance officer to conduct a frisk search if there are reasonable grounds to suspect that a traveler is hiding something or carrying something dangerous. This would not change under Bill C-23. If there is a need for a search requiring the removal of clothing, the current law obligates U.S. officers to request a Canadian counterpart to conduct the search. This, too, will remain the same. The only difference under C-23 is that the U.S. officer could conduct the search if no Canadian officer is available. This would be extremely rare, and any such search would be subject to the same legal and constitutional protections as would apply to a search done by a Canadian officer. And historical experience over the past 60 years would indicate that any conflict in relation to those rules governing searches would have happened exactly 0 times, based on the experience over 6 decades. With respect to detention, U.S. officers would not have the power to arrest or charge travelers in Canada. Rather, as is currently the case under existing law, a U.S. preclearance officer who has reasonable grounds to believe that a traveler has committed an offense must turn the traveler over to Canadian authorities as quickly as possible. With no exceptions, only Canadian authorities will determine whether charges should be laid. With respect to travelers wishing to withdraw from a preclearance area, they will be entitled to do so, but they could be required to identify themselves and give their reasons for withdrawing. And this is simply to prevent the illicit probing of preclearance sites by people trying to find weaknesses in border security before leaving the preclearance area undetected. And with respect to the arming of officers, U.S. officers in Canada will only be entitled to carry the same weapons as Canadian Border Services officers do in the same environment. For example, because Canadian officers do not generally carry firearms inside airport terminals, U.S. officers would not be authorized to carry firearms there either. Most importantly, Madam Speaker, this bill says explicitly that American preclearance officers must exercise their powers and perform their duties under this Act in accordance with Canadian law, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the Canadian Human Rights Act. As I said earlier, the alternative is for travelers to be processed entirely in the United States with no Canadian legal protections. The preclearance agreement between Canada and the United States provides for full reciprocity, so that too is laid out in Bill C-23. No power or privilege is conferred upon the officers of one country and not the other. This is an important point to bear in mind as Canada studies and pursues future opportunities to set up Canadian preclearance services in the U.S. for people and goods that are bound for Canada. Expansion of the service also includes preclearance of cargo. During the Prime Minister's recent visit to Washington, Canada and the U.S. both recognized the success of existing preclearance operations for travelers, and we declared our mutual commitment to establish cargo preclearance in order to make trade across our border faster, easier, and more secure. All of this, Madam Speaker, fits within our government's overarching objectives of growing the economy and creating jobs, and it upholds our platform commitment to foster a productive relationship with the United States in the interests of our mutual prosperity and security, and all while safeguarding our Canadian rights and freedoms. Madam Speaker, since I began my remarks about 20 minutes ago, over $25 million worth of goods and services have been traded across our border with the United States, and over 5,000 people have traveled across that boundary. But the potential for even more trade and travel between our two countries and for greater economic growth is strong. We can and we must make the border flow of people and goods faster, easier, and more secure. That is what Bill C-23 will achieve, and it will do so while allowing more Canadian travellers to enjoy the protection of Canadian law and the protection of the Charter when going through U.S. customs procedures. Madam Speaker, this is an important debate. I thank the House for their attention this afternoon, and I look forward to the constructive input that I'm sure honourable members will offer during today's debate and throughout the legislative process on Bill C-23. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires.